In the past several years, the United Nations General Assembly has overwhelmingly voted against the Cuban embargo. The Cuban embargo, as the Cubans call it, the blockade, has been a reality for the last 6 decades, and it continues to this day. Most people are unaware of the details of the Cuban embargo, so we're going to take a look at the series of American laws that make up the embargo. Now, before we begin, it's important to note that the purpose of the embargo is to wreak havoc on Cuba's economy. In fact, this is actually admitted in a U.S. State Department memo concerning the Cuban Revolution. The Cuban embargo or blockade consists of mainly 5 pieces of legislation. 2 of those, and the most damaging, came after the fall of the Soviet Union, which left Cuba in a tough economic situation because the Soviet bloc was Cuba's main support and trading partner. But let's begin by looking at the first 3 pieces of legislation instituted shortly after the triumph of the Cuban Revolution. The first is the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917, which was applied in 1960 to completely stop sugarcane imports from Cuba. Keep in mind that sugarcane was Cuba's main export product and its biggest buyer was the U.S. In fact, the U.S. actually used to buy all of Cuba's sugar. This law also prohibited any type of financial transaction with Cuba. The second piece of legislation was the 1961 Foreign Assistance Act, which pretty much put the nail in the coffin on all trade between the United States and Cuba. It forbade any assistance to communist countries, including Cuba, and it also forbade assistance to any country that gave any assistance to Cuba. Let's put this into perspective. This is the most powerful nation on earth, economically, militarily, and technologically, making a law to not only punish Cuba, but to punish any country that provides any type of assistance to Cuba. The third piece of legislation was the 1963 Cuban Assets Control Regulations. The intention of this legislation was to isolate the Cuban government economically and deprive it of the use of the American dollar. This legislation froze all Cuban assets in the U.S. and mandated the U.S. Treasury Department to regulate all commercial transactions with Cuba, including authorized travel to Cuba by U.S. nationals. Now, there are 2 points I want to make on this legislation. The first is that the U.S. dollar was the international currency as it is today. Second, by preventing financial transactions between U.S. nationals and Cuba, this law made it difficult for Americans to travel to Cuba. Now, these pieces of legislation had a drastic effect on Cuba. However, since Cuba had established a partnership with the Soviet bloc, they were able to offset or to stay afloat. However, in 1989, unfolding events inside the Soviet Union that eventually led to its collapse had a devastating impact on Cuba. In the following years, Cuba's domestic product shrank 35%. Export and import both fell over 80%. The effect on Cuba's economy was so dramatic that Fidel Castro likened it to the sun shutting down. This began what is known in Cuba as the Special Period. Now, because of this, the anti-Cuban revolution elements in the U.S., especially Miami, were celebrating. To them, it was only a matter of time before the collapse of the Cuban Revolution, and so they went to work, which takes us to the next 2 pieces of legislation against Cuba. The first, post-Soviet piece of legislation against Cuba was the 1992 Cuban Democracy Act, also known as the Torricelli Act. Officially, the intention of this legislation was to seek a peaceful transition to democracy and a resumption of economic growth in Cuba. But in reality, the law forbade subsidiaries of the U.S. companies and other countries from trading with Cuba, U.S. nationals from traveling to Cuba, and money being sent to the country from relatives or friends. The main point of this law was to encourage governments of other countries that conduct trade with Cuba to restrict their trade and credit relations. It also imposed sanctions on any countries that provided any assistance to Cuba. The second post-Soviet piece of legislation against Cuba was the 1996 Cuban Liberty and Democrat Solidarity Act, also known as the Helms-Burton Act. This act sought to strengthen international sanctions against the Cuban government, including cutting Cuba's economic assistance, trading relationships with third countries, and opposing Cuba's membership in international financial institutions. Now, we always hear from those that support the Cuban embargo that Cuba is free to trade with all other nations without any restrictions. However, as these last two pieces of legislation illustrate, that most definitely is not the case. Here's an interview clip by Christina Escobar, a very popular journalist in Cuba. Listen to what she has to say about the Cuban embargo and how it not only forbids normal trade with the U.S., but how it stifles trade with other countries.
I was born under the blockade, as most of the Cuban population. So it's kind of a reality in which we just live in, and sometimes it's hard to actually relate how our lives are impacted by the sanctions. But in so many ways, because the U.S. economy is probably the most powerful economy in the world. And they believe they own, for example, the currency, the U.S. dollars. They manage, or they have some sort of hegemony over every international economic creditors and all of that. Banks, everyone is afraid of the United States, basically. There are very few institutions, banks, enterprises, companies that are able to bypass sanctions that say directly you can't deal with Cuba in any way. That comes from buying a piece of equipment that has over 10% of US made or US owned parts, that goes with buying cell phones, that goes with dealing with practically any bank in the world. So if you as a country are going to buy something, import food, for example, and Cuba does import a lot of food, then you have to do it. You have to bypass the sanctions. So every bank finds Cuba because it's a risky country. It's considered a risky country. So like in Cuba, you don't have, it's hard to get a car. It's hard to get equipment for agriculture. It's hard to get equipment to do journalism. So it's basically every part of our lives are impacted.
If you found value in this video, please hit the like button. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell for more videos. Thank you for watching.